In this session, we are going to talk about the cyber security and how it really helps the bank's executives. What all regarding the cyber security a bank executive needs to be aware of. So the focus is more on that. And whenever we are bringing in the word cyber security, we are referring to the ability to protect or defend the use of the cyberspace, more to the internet related space from cyber attacks. So our data getting stolen, right? The networks getting attacked, all these things come under the cyber attacks. Now, so this is a article which primarily focuses on what all the cyber security related aspects does a bank needs to be comfortable with. So, as a part of this session, I want to look at the various functions that go, important 5-step functions that go as a part of the cyber security framework, wherein we talk about identifying all the different kinds of information threats. So what is the process of identifying the various information threats? How can a bank get into the protection? What are the various measures available to protect the various systems of the bank, various data that is collected from various sources? So what are the mechanisms that are available to protect? Then comes the third major aspect where the detection comes up. What kind of intrusions can happen? What kind of data breaches can happen? What kind of unauthorized access can happen through to the banking systems? So having some amount of an understanding of these different kinds of intrusions, how do you detect them? Then how do you respond to all those kind of attacks? So what kind of plan do you have in place to respond to those attacks? What kind of checklist do you need to have where you need to react immediately after a kind of a cyber attack? And finally, we talk about the recovery stage. Okay, we are attacked. Now, how do we get back? Now, that is what talks about a recovery plan. So, that's what we are going to look at. So, as a part of the 5 core functions, as a part of the security framework, we talk about first how to identify different kinds of cyber risks. So some kind of risk could be internal, means done by the employees, systems, processes, etc. Sometimes the attacks are external. There could be an from outside. There could be a raid on the banking data. There could be an intrusion into the security framework. All right. So we need to identify what are the different kinds of cyber risks that the bank can face. Then what all different items, especially the systems and the data that needs to be protected. How do you detect all these intrusions, breaches, unauthorized access? What are the different ways to detect them? How do you respond in case there is a cyber threat that has occurred? And finally, what is your recovery process? So that how quickly are you able to restore your operations? How quickly are you able to get back to your services? Now, the first step, identifying the information threats. So for that, we need to have a detailed risk assessment process in place. We know the definition of the risk, we know. It's a potential for loss, where all we can lose. Some kind of a damage can occur, destruction of an asset can occur, some kind of an exploitation or vulnerability resulting in a loss, and especially a financial loss. That is what we are defining the risk as. Now, so how do you define, or what are the different kinds of attacks that can happen? Especially here, our focus is with respect to information. right? Because we are only focusing on cyber attacks. So our risk assessment process first should get into classification of the information. Different kinds of information, right? First make a broad classification of the different kinds of information that you have. Probably when I say classification, some information could be crown jewels, like something extremely important and known to only one or two few people. Then comes the next layer, confidential. Only a few people should know that information, but not everyone. But it is very crucial information. Or sometimes we require the information only for the internal use. We don't want the external guys to really know about that information. Some information is restricted, and the final is public, whatever is the information that even an outsider can know. So we have to really get into the classification of the information into all these kind of categories. So crown jewels is very restricted kind of an information to a public information where everyone can typically access. Then for each kind of information, get into the identification of threats and vulnerabilities. What all different threats can occur to each of this information. In some cases, natural disasters can spoil the information. They are not in our hands, they are external. Similarly, I can have sometimes internal threats damaging this information. Some kind of malicious software can come out. Or probably I can have employees because of their evil intent, or it could be because of their unawareness trying to steal the information of the company. Or in some cases it could be even a physical attack, right? There could be internet threats, some kind of viruses coming up, hacking happening. All these things are the different threats and vulnerabilities that can occur to our information. So first we are classifying the information. For each classified information, we are trying to find out what are the threats and vulnerabilities. Then we need to have a measure. So each of the information, initially I'll give a value. Is it a highly valued information? Is it a medium or is it low? Very highly critical information will be categorized as high and normal information will be categorized as low. Even the risk level, in case if it gets stolen, what is it? Is that risk associated? Is the chance that it can be stolen is high, medium, low? And based on these, the prioritization of the action plan will happen. So the final level, whether if it is risky or moderate risky or low risky, depends on what kind of action that we are taking. And the entire risk assessment process need to be communicated to the board and the senior management appropriately. So this is where the whole first step of risk identification lies. First thing, classify all your information assets, then identify what kind of threats and vulnerabilities are possible to each kind of information, have a proper process in place to measure the risk and communicate the same to the board and the senior management. Right? So in short, if we are seeing, so as a part of the risk assessment, we are doing the threats, the vulnerabilities, getting into the mitigating activities, the control. Based on that, we are identifying and prioritizing the gaps in our current process. So we'll update the policies based on this assessment, we'll update the procedures, we'll update the controls, and again comes a new set of processes, controls, etc. That is how the whole risk identification process helps us in achieving better goals of the organization. Then comes the next step, protecting. Now that we have identified different kinds of information, we have classified it. So now we had planned what kind of measures for what, then we are trying to protect. So there could be different protection mechanisms. We can bring in an authentication, username, password. Now in many cases, a single factor authentication may be inadequate. Probably I may need to have 2 3 methods of authentication. Probably I may be asked for a username password, but at the same time I may also have to enter a one time password which I get on my mobile phone or through my email, or I may have to do two kinds of validation, one through a mobile phone and one through an email. So there could be multi factors that can come in as a part of the authentication, especially for high risk transactions. Don't just keep one kind of identification, one kind of authentication mode. Let there be multiple factors getting into the authentication process. The main intention is money laundering needs to be prevented, terrorist financing needs to be stopped. So probably if the access to these kind of systems come up, all these kinds of nuance activities can come up. The fraud can be one of the major drivers for, one of the major motives for getting into the authentication of the customer. So we can stop all these things by protecting more and more strong authentication systems in place. We can inhibit the identify the theft. All these things can very well happen through proper customer authentication. Then we are talking about not just authentication, we are also looking at the access control. Yes, this person's user ID and password are valid, but what all can he access? Can he access the reports of the CEO? Can he access all the internal reports? So that is where the access controls also needs to be very strong. The crown jewel information which can be accessed only by some of the very crucial people in the organization, I need to separate that from less sensitive assets. Something which can be accessed by everyone. I can't keep both of them in the same location and ask the people not to view this information. I have to have a kind of a barrier in place which will separate the crown jewels from the less sensitive assets, right? And I have to decide what kind of employees have what kind of access. So what is the role of the employee in the organization and what is the access that he is having towards what kind of information. Very crucial aspect, because that is where the thefts are, theft and misuse are very much possible. Then we are talking about security to the data itself. We have different kinds of loss prevention techniques, right? We can do a data encryption, we can get into a wireless network. So there should be a very solid information security program in place which can protect our data to a large extent. Then configuration for our hardware, software, they really need to be up to date. If there are any unnecessary accounts, people leaving the organization, etc., they need to be removed. Any kind of unnecessary services, because there will be a lot of default services that come as a part of the installation. So we need to be very careful that any kind of unwanted services we can very well remove. If any particular operating system or any particular antivirus internet securities, if they have released some kind of patches, let's make sure that we update automatically all the patches, tools, processes, and make sure that this entire administrative route to the entire system network is given to only a few people who are held responsible for any kind of attack that happens on the systems. And then we can even have a protection through a firewall, which is more like protect from the intruders. Put a kind of a shield against the intruder. It's a kind of a barrier. So between our network and the external. It's a kind of a barrier that shields information to be accessed from our network to the outside world, right? So we will not get the malicious or unnecessary internet traffic. So I can make it either software based, or in some cases that can be protected through a hardware as well. So there should be a clear plan in place how to protect different systems, assets and data from the cyber attacks. That's the step number 2. in a cybersecurity framework. Then moving on to the step 3, we are looking at now comes the proactive part, detecting. How do I really detect if an intrusion has occurred or not? If my data has been hacked or not? If someone had an unauthorized access to my networks or not? So this is where we really need to have a few processes in place. Any kind of a deviation that is occurring from the normal operations, right? I need to have some kind of super systems in place, intrusion detection systems. Again, there are different kinds of technologies that are available to address, but someone intruding into my system, I need to get an information. If my network is not behaving in the usual manner, like either more bandwidth space being consumed or whatever, in that case, I need to have some kind of detection system. If there is any kind of an anomaly in the network behavior, I should be the team should be informed on that. The log analyzer, right? Different kinds of transactions that are performed, there needs to be a clear reporting on that. All kinds of configuration management, version management kind of tools need to be in place, and the integrity monitoring, the complete monitoring of the network, we need to have a few kind of tools in place. So all these things, if I look at the intrusion detection, they look at the various areas of the computer. From the computer network, they look at different areas like the Windows folder, like the networks, all these things. They try to see wherever a security breach is possible, they try to identify that. If you are talking about network behavior anomaly detection tool, they are monitoring the network if there are any kind of unusual events or trends. They look at the network characteristics in real time. If at all any kind of an anomalous event is identified, then probably there is an alarm that is generated. So there is a real-time monitoring, notification, reporting of the log data, which will really help us in identifying at the right time if there is any kind of a breach that has occurred on our system. Some of the things, if I look at the common cyber attacks that happen with the banks, denial of service, right? Some kind of an online service becomes unavailable because of too much of a traffic. Virtually, because of the breach, the systems are loaded with too much of a traffic, and a couple of online services which are high critical online services become unavailable. Now, nowadays, these are becoming very, very dangerous. The intensity, the sophistication of the intruders is becoming so high that they are coming up with some way or the other creating this kind of a denial of a service. It comes under operation risk as well as reputation. If a couple of services get halted, high priority services get halted, mission critical services get halted, probably the reputation of the companies are at risk. So it's a very, very critical aspect. Similarly, we talk about CATO, corporate account takeover kind of attacks. So the company's account, the bank's account will be hacked, taken over, and from there some kind of unauthorized messages and transactions are being sent. The whole attack is in the whole account is with the thief, which will create all kinds of confusion and all kinds of worries among the customers. Similarly, ATM cash out attacks. So this is a straightforward one. They are finding out ways in terms of getting cash out of the ATM. So they gain the access to alter the settings of the ATM, and probably they steal in millions. So that's a kind of a loss that could occur. And then we are talking about a crypto locker attacks. It's a kind of a malware, right? Some kind of software virus. it is sent through the mails and it has some kind of attachment. And in case you open the attachment, it tries to eat up all your data across all your files in the system. It encrypts that entire data, and if at all you want to decrypt it back, it asks for a charge. So all these kinds of attacks are very much possible on the banks, not just on the bank, but here our focus is more on the bank. That's where we are talking about it. So these things need to be detected through various tools, and probably all the proactive measures need to be taken at appropriate time. Then comes the fourth step, the response. Okay, we have done all that is needed, but still the attack has occurred. How do I respond? Now this is where we need to have a plan in place. Even how do we respond? Initially itself we need to have a plan in place. That's where we talk about a team, a core team consisting of CEO, head IT, legal, HR, people from all critical departments of the organization should comprise of a team. And a leader needs to be selected from that team, especially for any kind of an event which is treated as a cyber attack. So there should be a proper process in place. How do you report it? What are the different kinds of steps in it? So what are the timelines? When do we do what? And the checklist of the item. That entire thing needs to be prepared, which is what we call as the incident response plan. The moment we see that some attack has occurred, what needs to be done? There should be a proper plan in place with clear details, steps, timelines, checklists, etc. So, how to address? If a damage has occurred, how to address it? So, how much of loss we can incur and how do I mitigate that kind of a loss? Right? To what extent I can prevent it? So, do we really need to capture the evidence for this? Right? Do we will we be going for legal aspects? So, what kind of evidences do we need to capture from that incident? Somewhere, in what cases we will be typically informing this to the forensic team and getting their expert advice on it. Now, what kind of services got affected, especially network, connectivity, what kind of services that we are providing to the third parties got affected because of this attack. So, how much time we will need to get back? What are the how many resources, what kind of resources are needed to implement the recovery strategy? Now, what kind of strategy we need to implement and how effective it is going to be? And how long the solutions are intended to last. All these things need to be very clearly documented as a part of the plan, and it has to be communicated across to all the key parties in the organization. So whatever a data breach occurred, it has to be communicated, but there should be a plan in place. What part of it will be reported to the media? So what is the way of reporting this incident to all the affected individuals? What is the best medium of notifying the stakeholders? Do we call up? Do we give a press notice? Or what is the appropriate mechanism? So how is the media responding to this breach? So basically having some kind of guideline for tracking and analyzing the media related stuff, and who all needs to be provided information and in what form. That entire communication scheme should be present as a part of the incident response plan. So there is a kind of a checklist which has to be adhered to probably the moment the breach has occurred. Within 24 hours of a breach occurring, all these steps need to be done. Find out, record the date and time when the breach first has occurred, when it was discovered, and when the response effort started beginning. Now, whosoever needs to be informed, especially the response team, give a message to each one as quickly as possible. Activate everyone on the response team because the response has to be much quicker. So the entire premises needs to be secured, especially where the data breach has occurred, because if required, remove the network connection so that further attacks can very well be prevented. And at the same time, the evidence need to be preserved. So there should be a quick action around the area where the data breach has occurred. So stop additional further data losses occurring, which means affect all the servers, network, whatever it is, make them offline. And whatever you know about the breach, just document it. Who discovered it? Who reported it? There are so many things that you can think of about the breach. When did it happen? How did you notice it? All that stuff typically needs to be documented. And whosoever were involved in the discovering of that breach, so just have an interview with them. Find out how they came to know about it. What prompted them to say that there is a breach. And anyone else whom you think will know about the incident, try interviewing them, get as much of information as possible. And find out what are the kind of protocols to whom we need to communicate the breach in what manner. So identify it and actually communicate the same. Right? Assess all the priorities and the risks regarding the breach. So all the authorities, there should be a proper communication, especially the regulator of the bank and all needs to be communicated as early as possible. And if required, even a legal opinion also need to be taken as early as possible so that if required, an in-depth investigation can very well be initiated. And once everything is done, okay, the first 24 hours gone, we need to have a detailed recovery plan. Okay, the investigation will take its own time. That's the incident response. But in a long run, we are also looking at the recovery. So how do we rebuild the server? How do we rebuild the database? How do we rebuild the network? What all things have to be brought back into place? How do we restore the baseline configuration? Right? All what is the backup procedures? All needs to be in place. How will we reconnect the services without too much of disruption? And once the recovery is done, lessons learned. What improvements really need to be made? How do we make sure that these kind of attacks do not occur in future? Right? Whatever is the team which has been involved in the recovery process, just review it. Did they respond on time? So identify how much they have contributed, to what extent they have stopped the further damage. Is there any way that the incident response plan can be improved? Is there any new learnings that we can get and make sure that the next time these kind of breaches won't occur? All these things can very well be done as a part of the post-recovery meeting so that there could be a continuous improvement in the process. So this is what a bank's executives and employees need to be aware of regarding the cyber security. So all these areas, all these aspects which I mentioned as a part of the agenda, I think I've covered them in the last few minutes. So if you have any further queries, you can very well give me a call on the number given below, or you can send in an email at vamsidhar@pacegurus.com. Thanks a lot for listening to this video. Thank you very much.